The year is 1997. Apple Computer is dying, not struggling, not having a bad quarter, not going through a rough patch. Dying. The company that changed personal computing forever, the company that introduced the world to the mouse, to the graphical interface, to the idea that computers could be beautiful, is 90 days away from bankruptcy. 90 days. And the man who could save it, the only man in the entire world with enough money, enough power, and enough reason to write that check, is Bill Gates. The same Bill Gates who Apple had sued for stealing their ideas. The same Bill Gates whose Windows operating system had crushed Apple's market share. The same Bill Gates who Steve Jobs had called a thief to his face. And on August 6, 1997, Bill Gates did write that check. $150 million wired directly into Apple's bank account, keeping the company alive. But here's the question nobody asks. What if that wasn't enough? What if Gates had decided, why save a dying competitor when I can just buy it? What if instead of an investment, he made an acquisition offer? What would the world look like today if Microsoft had bought Apple in 1997? Stay with me, because this story is stranger than any fiction, and the details almost nobody knows. To understand why this almost happened, you need to understand what the world looked like in 1997. Microsoft was everything. Windows 95 had sold 7 million copies in its first 5 weeks. It was the fastest-selling software product in history at the time. Bill Gates was the richest man on the planet. Microsoft's market cap was approaching $200 billion. They had a monopoly on personal computing so complete, so total, that the U.S. Department of Justice was preparing an antitrust case against them. Microsoft didn't just dominate the market, Microsoft was the market. And Apple? Apple was a ghost of what it had been. In 1997, Apple had a 3.1% market share, 3.1%, down from nearly 20% a decade earlier. Their stock price had fallen from a high of $70 per share to around $13. They had burned through 3 CEOs in 5 years. Their product line was a disaster, 17 different versions of the Macintosh, so confusing that even Apple's own employees couldn't explain the differences. They were losing $300 million every single quarter. Think about that. Every 90 days, $300 million gone, just gone. Michael Dell, the founder of Dell Computers, was asked at a public conference what he would do if he were in charge of Apple. His answer was immediate and brutal. I'd shut it down and give the money back to the shareholders. That was the world's opinion of Apple in 1997, a dead company walking. But how did Apple fall so far so fast? The answer is one name, one decision, one moment in 1985 that set everything in motion. John Sculley. In 1983, Steve Jobs had personally recruited John Sculley away from PepsiCo to be Apple's CEO. Jobs had asked him the famous question, do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water, or do you want a chance to change the world? Sculley chose to change the world. And then, 2 years later, Sculley fired Steve Jobs. The board sided with Sculley over Jobs in a power struggle. And on May 31, 1985, Steve Jobs was removed from the Macintosh division he had built, stripped of his responsibilities, humiliated in the company he had co-founded. Jobs resigned, took 5 Apple employees with him, started a new company called Next, and Apple, without Jobs, began its slow, painful, decade-long decline. The products got worse, the vision disappeared, the magic was gone. Sculley was replaced by Michael Spindler. Spindler was replaced by Gil Amelio. Each new CEO promised to turn things around. Each new CEO made things worse. By 1996, things were so desperate that Apple's board was seriously discussing selling the company entirely. They had conversations with Sun Microsystems. They had conversations with IBM. They even had preliminary discussions with Philips. Nothing worked out. And then Gil Amelio made one decision, the decision that would accidentally save Apple and accidentally almost destroy it at the same time. he decided to buy Next, Steve Jobs' company, for $427 million. Jobs came back to Apple as an advisor, and then, within months, the board fired Gil Amelio and made Jobs interim CEO. The prodigal son had returned. But returning to a dying company is not the same as saving it, and in the summer of 1997, the company was still dying. It was June 1997. Steve Jobs had been back at Apple for less than 6 months. He was technically the interim CEO, the ICEO as people mockingly called him. The I standing for interim, not for the revolution that letter would later represent. Jobs was working 18-hour days, cutting products, firing people, trying to stop the bleeding, and then he picked up the phone and called Bill Gates. What happened on that call? The exact words, the exact tone, the exact moment when Gates understood what Jobs was really asking has never been fully reported. But we know the outcome. Jobs told Gates that Apple needed money, not eventually, not soon, now. And he made Gates an offer that was either brilliant or desperate or both. Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple. In exchange, Apple would drop its long-running lawsuit against Microsoft for stealing the look and feel of the Macintosh operating system. Apple would also make Microsoft's Internet Explorer the default browser on every Mac. Gates said yes. Why? Here is where it gets interesting. Here is what most people miss entirely when they tell this story. The simple answer is, Gates saved a competitor to avoid a monopoly conviction. The U.S. Department of Justice was building its antitrust case against Microsoft. The argument was that Microsoft had an illegal monopoly on personal computing. And one of the strongest pieces of evidence was that Apple was dying. If Apple disappeared, Microsoft would control more than 95% of the personal computer market. That number would make the antitrust case almost impossible to defend. A living Apple, even a weak, struggling, barely breathing Apple, gave Microsoft cover. We don't have a monopoly. Look, Apple exists. There's competition. So Gates wrote the check, $150 million, not out of generosity, not out of respect for Jobs, not out of sentiment or nostalgia or admiration, out of pure strategic calculation. But here is the detail that changes everything. $150 million was not enough to save Apple. Jobs knew it. Gates probably knew it. Anyone who looked at Apple's books knew it. Apple was losing $300 million every quarter. Gates had just given them enough money to survive for 6 months, maybe. Which brings us to the question at the heart of this story. Why didn't Gates just buy Apple? In the months surrounding this investment, there were serious internal discussions at Microsoft about a full acquisition of Apple. Not a rumor, not speculation, documented discussions, real conversations between real executives with real numbers on real spreadsheets. The logic was straightforward. Apple's total market cap in mid-1997 was approximately $2 billion. For Microsoft, a company with $200 billion in market cap and billions in cash reserves, $2 billion was nothing. It was a rounding error. It was less than 1% of their value. For $2 billion, Microsoft could own the Apple brand, one of the most recognizable brands in the world, the Macintosh operating system. Still technically superior to Windows in several ways, Apple's hardware manufacturing capabilities, Apple's retail relationships, and most importantly, Steve Jobs. The discussions got serious enough that people inside both companies knew about them. So why didn't it happen? 3 reasons, and each one is more interesting than the last. Reason number 1, the antitrust problem. Remember why Gates wrote the check in the first place? To prove Microsoft wasn't a monopoly. If Microsoft bought Apple, the exact opposite message would be sent to the Department of Justice. It would be the single most damaging thing Microsoft could possibly do in the middle of an antitrust investigation. It would be handing the government a weapon and asking them to use it. Gates's lawyers almost certainly told him, "Do not buy Apple, not now, not while we're fighting this case. The investment is enough. Keep them alive, keep them independent, keep the illusion of competition alive." Reason number 2, the culture problem. Microsoft and Apple were not just competitors, they were philosophical opposites. Microsoft believed software should run on any hardware. Apple believed hardware and software should be one unified experience. Microsoft sold to businesses. Apple sold to creative people. Microsoft optimized for compatibility. Apple optimized for beauty. Merging these two cultures would have been, in the words of people who worked at both companies, like mixing fire and water. The Microsoft engineers would have killed everything that made Apple, Apple. And reason number 3, and this is the most human reason of all. Bill Gates was afraid of Steve Jobs. Not physically afraid, not personally afraid, but strategically, professionally, deeply afraid of what Jobs was capable of. Gates had watched Jobs build Apple from nothing in the late 70s. He had watched Jobs create the Macintosh, a product so good that Microsoft had spent a decade trying to copy it. He had watched Jobs build Next and Pixar while he was exiled from Apple. Gates knew, better than anyone, that Steve Jobs was the most dangerous person in the technology industry. If Microsoft bought Apple, Jobs would leave, immediately, and then Jobs would build something new, something better, something that would compete directly with Microsoft. Better to keep Jobs contained inside a struggling Apple than to set him free with $2 billion in his pocket. So Gates made the investment, kept Apple alive, kept Jobs busy, and walked away from the acquisition. The announcement was made on August 6, 1997 at the Macworld conference in Boston. Jobs walked onto the stage. The crowd was restless, anxious. They had heard rumors. They didn't know what was coming. And then Bill Gates appeared on the giant screen behind Jobs, live, via satellite. The crowd booed, not politely, not quietly, loudly, viscerally. The sound of thousands of Apple faithful seeing their enemy's face on their sacred stage. Jobs let the booing go on for a moment. Then he raised his hand, and he said something that almost nobody in that room wanted to hear. We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose. He talked about partnership, about moving forward, about what was best for Apple's customers. And then he announced the investment. $150 million from Microsoft. Internet Explorer as the default browser on Mac. The lawsuit dropped. The crowd was stunned. Some cheered, many didn't. Jobs knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't celebrating, he wasn't grateful, he was buying time. And with that time, he built everything. But let's ask the question this entire story has been building toward. What if Gates had made the acquisition offer? What if instead of $150 million, he had offered $2 billion? What if Steve Jobs, desperate, exhausted, running a company hemorrhaging cash, had said yes? Scenario 1, Jobs takes the money and leaves. Microsoft acquires Apple. Jobs receives his payout, somewhere between $50 and $100 million for his shares. He walks out the door, and then what? Jobs had already proven he could build world-changing companies from scratch. He had done it twice, Apple and Next. With $100 million in his personal bank account, he would have started something new within a year, something focused, something hungry, something without the baggage of a dying company. Would it have been the iPhone, the iPad, something we can't even imagine? We don't know, but we know this. Steve Jobs without constraints was more dangerous than Steve Jobs with them. Scenario 2, Microsoft kills Apple slowly, the more likely outcome. Microsoft buys Apple, integrates it, and slowly suffocates everything that made it special. The Mac becomes a Windows variant, the design philosophy disappears. The think different culture gets replaced by Microsoft's corporate structure. No iMac in 1998, no iPod in 2001, no iTunes, no iPhone in 2007, no iPad, no App Store, no ecosystem. The most valuable company in the history of the world simply never exists. And Microsoft? Microsoft probably gets broken up by the Department of Justice anyway. The antitrust case proceeds. The acquisition of Apple makes it worse. Gates spends the next decade in court instead of building products. Two giants, both diminished, both distracted, both losing. Here is what this story is actually about. It is not about Microsoft and Apple. It is not about Gates and Jobs. It is not about money or technology or the 1990s. It is about the difference between a transaction and a transformation. Gates saw Apple as a transaction, a problem to be solved, a liability to be managed. He wrote the minimum check necessary to achieve his strategic goal and moved on. Jobs saw the same moment as a transformation. The worst moment in Apple's history became the foundation for everything that came after. He took Gates's money written to protect Microsoft, and used it to build the most valuable company the world has ever seen. Same money, same moment, completely different vision. Gates was playing defense, Jobs was playing offense, and that difference, that single difference in how two men looked at the same situation, is worth more than any MBA, any business school case study, any management book ever written. The person who sees a crisis as a transaction will survive it. The person who sees a crisis as a transformation will use it to build an empire. Apple in 1997 was 90 days from bankruptcy. Apple in 2024 is worth $3 trillion. Same company, same brand, different vision. The question is never whether you're in a crisis. The question is what you decide to do with it. Bill Gates stepped down as Microsoft CEO in 2000. In 2001, 4 years after saving Apple with his investment, the iPod launched. It had nothing to do with computers. It was a music player. Nobody at Microsoft had seen it coming. In 2007, the iPhone launched. It destroyed the mobile industry that Microsoft had been trying to enter for years. Microsoft's mobile strategy, which they had invested billions in, was made irrelevant almost overnight. In 2010, the iPad launched. It created an entirely new product category. Microsoft scrambled to respond for years. Bill Gates's $150 million investment in 1997 returned, conservatively, over 10,000 times its value to Apple. And Microsoft, the company that was supposed to bury Apple, spent the next 2 decades watching from the sidelines as their old enemy became the most valuable company in human history. The check that was supposed to keep Apple small enough to be irrelevant became the seed money for the most remarkable comeback in business history. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is keep your enemy alive.